For the longest time, a bunch of companies have been trying to get the feel of a steering wheel in the palm of your hand. You know, something to avoid that big bulk setup of having a big steering wheel thing just hooked up in front of you on a table or something. And one company called Performance got really close. This is the Ultra Racer 64 for the Nintendo 64. At first glance, you'd probably think that this isn't a Nintendo 64 controller because it's missing one very important feature that Nintendo 64 is kind of known for: the joystick. That little tiny thumbstick that sits right in the center of the controller is not to be found on this one, which is kind of funny because pretty much every single Nintendo 64 game utilizes it, and without it, you're pretty much only limited to racing games, and even then, it's kind of a stretch. So while it's fairly obvious that games like Mario 64 and even GoldenEye 64 will not work with this controller, what you probably wouldn't be expecting is that a lot of racing games also won't work with this controller alone. See, a lot of games out there utilize the joystick to just go around the menus, and when you can't move up and down, well, that knocks out a lot of games, including, believe it or not, Mario Kart 64. Now sure, you could always plug up a Nintendo 64 controller originally and then swap it out with this one as soon as the game starts, but who really wants to do that? And even at that point, there are tons and tons of racing games that make use of the up and down analog stick function. So without that, well, you can't really fully control the game, can you? And that happens with a lot of racing games, including Mario Kart 64, which is just very unfortunate. With all that being said, you'd probably think I'd hate this controller, but to be honest, I kinda like it. I've gotten used to using joysticks to drive cars in video games, but I've always just missed that feel of a steering wheel. And the steering wheel on this thing, although not the best feel in the world, is decent enough that you have way more control than a traditional joystick on the Nintendo 64 when driving any kind of vehicle. A joystick has a larger degree of freedom of movement because you can move up and down and pretty much all over the place, but a steering wheel can only go left and right, and you can hold your turns perfectly without having to worry about moving a little bit too high or a little bit too low, so every time you master a turn with this controller, you get the feeling that you could repeat that movement again without any issues whatsoever. Real Nintendo 64 controllers utilize the Z trigger on the back of the controller, which is really fun to use on a bunch of games, and of course, the guys that made this controller changed that up as well. This has a double-sided trigger. You push back on it and it hits the B button, or you pull it forward for the A button. And I know what you're thinking, well, why would you do that with the A and B buttons? But that's one of this controller's kind of really cool hidden features. You see, this controller, every single button can be remapped on the controller itself, which means whatever game you're playing can be completely customized to this controller's layout so it can be easier to play. Unless it's a game, like I said, that uses analog up or analog down, in which case it just won't work. So games like Diddy Kong Racing simply won't work with this controller because you can't operate all the vehicles in the game, which is unfortunate since they did build this whole remappability thing right into the controller. You'd think they would have figured out some way to just have some analog up and analog down feature. That's just kinda sad. But after all that negativity, you might be wondering why I like this controller so much. Well, there's a really good reason that I think you should buy this controller. F-Zero 64. This is gotta be the greatest controller ever made for this game because I can't envision ever playing this game without it. It just works so perfectly. You have some of the best controls ever on a racing game for the Nintendo 64 combined with the precision input of a steering wheel. F-Zero is the kind of game that moves really, really fast, and with this controller you can cut in between opponents like they're not even there. I can understand why this controller wasn't that popular because you just couldn't use it with a lot of games, but if everyone knew that F-Zero was better with this controller, well heck, I think a lot of people would have picked this controller up not because it's a controller that works with everything, but it's a controller that works really well with a handful of games. So as you can see, the Ultra Racer 64 is a really neat controller with a lot of awesome features, but because it lacks the ability for analog stick movement up and down, I just can't recommend it. See, without that feature, you're not able to go through a bunch of menus in games. And heck, maybe you're just playing a racing game that needs the ability to move the stick forward or back, and well, this controller here simply won't do that. And that sucks. Any third-party controller released on a platform needs to have the ability to work with pretty much every game out there, otherwise it can only work with a handful of games at best. And because this game is so specific, and it just doesn't work with every racing game out there, well, that just completely sucks.